Who is really behind the anti-Semitic arson attacks in Australia? Let's find out. I'm Hanna, criminal lawyer, and welcome to The What and the Why. On the 26th of August, the Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese made an announcement that sent shockwaves throughout the country and beyond.
A short time ago, we informed the Iranian ambassador to Australia that he would be expelled.
At the same press conference, Albanese also announced that the federal government will be listing one of the most important branches of Iran's armed forces, the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, or IRGC, as a terrorist organisation. The basis for this drastic move was the claim that the IRGC organised two of the anti-Semitic arson attacks in Australia late last year. Well, today I'm going to examine this claim and raise some serious concerns that I have with it. In doing so, I'll also explore an alternative theory, and that is that Israel was really behind the arson attacks. Let me start by setting the scene. But before I do so, I ask that you hit the subscribe button if you value the independent journalism that I do entirely for free. Since the beginning of Israel's brutal military offensive in Gaza in October 2023, there appears to have been a significant increase in anti-Semitic attacks on Jewish individuals, businesses, and places of worship in Australia. I say appears because most of the data we have comes from pro-Israel organisations such as the Executive Council of Australian Jewry and Community Security Group, which use the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, which conflates much criticism of Israel with criticism of Jewish people. But regardless, I think it's safe to say there has been an increase in anti-Semitic attacks, and it goes without saying that this is something that should be condemned. Now, some of the more high-profile attacks have been by way of arson, and there's two in particular that I'll be focusing on in this video for reasons that will become apparent. The first is the arson attack on a Jewish-owned deli, Lewis Continental Kitchen, in Sydney on the 20th of October last year. And the second is the firebombing of the Adass Israel Synagogue in Melbourne on the 6th of December last year. Now, fortunately, no one was killed in the attacks and only one person sustained minor injuries. But there was extensive property damage, and the fear and distress experienced by the victims and the Jewish community in general were no doubt very real. Now, the police forces of New South Wales and Victoria have conducted extensive and extremely well-resourced investigations into the arson attacks, and they've arrested numerous people they allege planned and carried out the crimes. Importantly, the police never alleged that any of the anti-Semitic attacks were carried out for political motives. Rather, it was asserted that at least several of the attacks were arranged by people involved in organised crime. But the federal government changed its tune last month when our primary spy agency, the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation, or ASIO, claimed to have uncovered the real culprit.
ASIO has now gathered enough credible intelligence to reach a deeply disturbing conclusion that the Iranian government directed at least two of these attacks.
Predictably, across Australia, the mainstream media outlets were quick to accept the government's claim at face value without any scrutiny.
For the first time since World War II, Australia has been attacked at the hands of a foreign country.
In a disturbing development, our spy agency ASIO has directly named Iran as the culprit behind two anti-Semitic attacks.
Iran's ambassador is at Sydney Airport tonight, about to leave the country. Ahmad Sadaki left his Canberra home today, expelled from Australia over Iran's role in anti-Semitic attacks at Bondi and in Melbourne.
While the media decided not to question the official narrative, I think there are some good reasons to doubt it, which I'll now unpack. Firstly, the government hasn't produced a single shred of evidence in support of its claim. In fact, it's not even clear that the government has any evidence. Rather, the decision was based on credible intelligence from ASIO. Intel is of course not the same as evidence. Intel is information that comes from a variety of sources, some of which can be highly unreliable. It's often vague, uncorroborated, and most importantly, can't be tested, which is why it's never allowed to be used in court. So what is ASIO's intel? Well, very little has been disclosed to the Australian public. This was as high as it was put by the Director General of Security in charge of ASIO, Mike Burgess, at the press conference when the announcement was first made.
So the embassy was not involved. No Iranian diplomats here in Australia were involved in this. This was directed by the IRGC through a series of overseas cutouts facilitators to coordinators that found their way to tasking Australians.
Despite the press conference being attended by some of Australia's most senior journalists, there was no real attempt to ask any questions that might meaningfully assist the public to decide whether or not to believe what are undeniably allegations of enormous importance to this country. They didn't ask who these alleged overseas cutouts or facilitators are, which country they're in, when they were engaged by the IRGC, why they were engaged, or how much they were paid. They also didn't ask what, if any, actual evidence ASIO has to substantiate its claims and if it's ever going to be presented. Apart from this press conference, the only other information that's been disclosed by a public official about this relates to the funding of the criminals alleged to have committed the attacks. In an interview the Prime Minister gave to the public broadcaster the ABC on the 26th of August, he appeared to suggest that ASIO had identified that the money that was used to pay the criminals in Australia came from the Iranian government but was sent via a series of intermediaries. So basically the claim is that Iran paid person A, who then paid person B, who then paid person C, and this kept going until the money eventually reached the offenders here. The show's host, Sarah Ferguson, then asked Albanese to confirm that it had been established that the funds had originated from Iran.
So ASIO was able to trace funds going to Australia via cutouts all the way back to Iran. Is that clear from their investigations?
That is very clear, that they were able to find clear evidence going back to individuals as well, and were very specific. They have not generalised about this. They have made sure that they can be certain.
Importantly, Albanese didn't say whether those individuals from whom the funds were paid were members of the IRGC or otherwise linked to the Iranian government. You might think that, if that were the case, he'd say it. I mean, that would arguably be a very damning piece of evidence, right? Instead, all we know is that someone in Iran allegedly made the payments. Now, if that's the best ASIO's got, it's pathetic. There are 91 million people who live in Iran, most of whom probably have a bank account. Moreover, many Iranians work as spies and collaborators for hostile foreign governments, particularly Israel and the US. For example, when Israel carried out its unilateral war against Iran in June this year, it used Iranian commandos who had been recruited and trained by Mossad to carry out attacks from within against Tehran's air defense systems. So if Israel can infiltrate Iran to the extent that it can get Iranian citizens to conduct military operations against their own country, is it really that difficult to imagine Israel getting Iranians to make some money transfers? Not only is it unclear whether the federal government can link the payments to the IRGC, but it's not even clear whether they've identified a single member of the IRGC that's involved in this alleged conspiracy. In the same interview with the ABC on the 26th of August, Ferguson asked the Prime Minister an important question, and I want you to listen very carefully to his answer.
And in terms of the individuals in Iran, inside the Revolutionary Guard inside Iran, you actually have the identity of those people who were directing these attacks?
Well, we certainly have the identity of people who were involved offshore as well as onshore, the elements that were used to carry out these attacks.
So that's what we call a non-responsive answer, because it didn't respond to the question he'd been asked. But instead of pressing Albanese to answer the question he just evaded, Ferguson moves on to another question.
So at the Iranian end, if you have the names of the individuals involved from the Revolutionary Guard, will you be seeking to sanction those individuals?
Now, the obvious problem with that question is that it was predicated on the premise that the government has confirmed that it's identified the members of the IRGC who it claims are involved. But that's precisely what Albanese declined to do when he avoided her question less than a minute earlier. Despite the shortcomings of Ferguson's question, it did give Albanese another opportunity to confirm whether the government has identified any members of the IRGC. And what did the PM do? He gave an entirely non-responsive answer again.
One of the things that we did, Sarah, was act very quickly. Once we had this confirmation, we had appropriate meetings of our internal processes. We put in place a mechanism as well to ensure that the Australian personnel at the embassy in Tehran were removed because we thought they would be at risk.
Now, Albanese went on for about another minute or so, but at no point did he actually answer the question. And I think the reason for that is probably pretty simple. The government hasn't identified any IRGC members as being involved in the anti-Semitic attacks. If it had, it would say so. Why? Because this would allay the growing concerns the Australian public has about the paucity of evidence to support the claims of Iranian involvement. The second reason to doubt ASIO's claims of Iranian involvement is that they don't sit well with the actual evidence that's already been produced by state police. ASIO alleges that Iran was pulling the strings behind the local criminals who carried out the attacks. But as I mentioned earlier, police in New South Wales and Victoria have already arrested various people who they say are the culprits. And based on publicly available information, not a single one of them has been charged with anything to do with Iran. The person who is alleged to be the organiser of the attack on the Lewis Continental Kitchen is Sayed Musawi, but neither the police nor the Director of Public Prosecutions have alleged any Iranian involvement in relation to his offending. When a person is charged with a criminal offence, the police are required to serve a document called a fact sheet, which summarises the evidence that the police have at the time of charging. The fact sheet is often updated as the evidence develops. Well, I've obtained a copy of the fact sheet for Moussawi's case that is current as at the 21st of July, so only a bit over a month before the government made its big announcement about Iranian involvement. Now, some of what I'm about to show you has not been the subject of any reporting to date. I can confirm that in Moussawi's fact sheet there is not a single mention of Iran or the IRGC. As you can see here, there are a couple of sentences that have been redacted, but I've spoken with Moussawi's lawyer Zamarai Katiz, and he's confirmed that Iran is not mentioned in the unredacted version either. Katiz has also informed me that the police have served a brief of evidence for Moussawi's case and that it doesn't refer to Iran either. Indeed, Katiz told me as recently as a few days ago that notwithstanding the government's declaration that Iran was responsible for the attacks, there's still been no mention of Iranian involvement by the prosecution. So either crucial evidence is being held back or it doesn't exist. Not only do the police not claim to have any evidence that Iran played a role in the attacks, but in my view, the evidence they do have raises serious concerns about the Australian government's claims. For example, while Moussawi is alleged to have called himself James Bond on the messaging app Signal, his operation was hopelessly unsophisticated. In fact, the people he's alleged to have recruited were so inept that they initially targeted the wrong business, Curly Lewis Brewery, because it had a similar name. And even then they stuffed up the first attempt, running away without even lighting a match. Moussawi is said to have complained about this, sending messages to his underlings saying, "Yous both failed the test, can't do one small thing," and "Fucking 16 years kid could have got it done." Also, when Moussawi was arrested, he was carrying the same mobile phone that he allegedly used to coordinate the attacks and which revealed that he was the user of the Signal account with the handle James Bond, which is a rookie error. If Iran really had some devious plan to carry out transnational terrorism in Australia, a plan of such high stakes that if it came undone, it would destroy its relationship with our government, do you really think it would leave it up to these amateurs to execute that plan? On top of all this, Moussawi says he was only getting paid $12,000 to do the arson attack. 12 grand? Seriously? Well, I don't know what the going rate is for international terrorist attacks, but as a criminal lawyer, I know that people usually get paid a whole lot more to do a whole lot less. Because ASIO hasn't presented any evidence, we're being asked to blindly trust the spy agency. But history teaches us that might not be such a great idea. In 2003, the US led what it called its Coalition of the Willing to illegally invade Iraq.
Last night, a square mile in central Baghdad seemed like hell on earth. An inferno.
The Australian government, which was led by Prime Minister John Howard at the time, was one of only 4 countries that contributed soldiers to the invading force.
We are determined to join other countries to deprive Iraq of its weapons of mass destruction.
This allegation that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction was based on what Howard described as, wait for it, credible intelligence from Australia's spy agencies. A subsequent inquiry by a parliamentary joint committee detailed how the Australian intel had originated from US and UK spy agencies, which was later revealed to be bogus. This, of course, was no comfort for the more than 1 million Iraqis who were estimated to have been killed as a consequence of the invasion, as well as the millions of others who became refugees and had their livelihoods destroyed. The WMD scandal was not the only incident that has called into question the impartiality and reliability of Australia's spy agencies. Indeed, their entire history has been highly politicised. For decades following ASIO's creation in 1949, its surveillance and other powers were directed almost entirely on left-wing and progressive forces in this country.
Secreted away behind office windows, they covertly recorded May Day parades, trade union rallies, people arriving for political meetings and conferences, leaving theatres and courthouses, citizens under suspicion.
ASIO also spied on Indigenous activists and their allies.
Very pleased to see them people come here. We're very pleased. What a wonderful friend they are.
In the 1960s, Frank Hardy was instrumental in social causes like the land rights movement. He supported and publicised the famous Wave Hill Station walk-off. Soon ASIO were keeping files on Aboriginal activists.
In the late 1960s to 70s, ASIO spent much of its time spying on Australians it labelled as dangerous subversives, whose only sin was to be involved in peaceful protests against the Vietnam War. These ASIO files were used to stop the more hardcore activists from being employed by the federal government. ASIO also monitored Australians who campaigned against the apartheid regime in South Africa. In fact, ASIO cooperated closely with the apartheid South African Bureau of State Security, which effectively led its Australian counterpart. In the late 1980s, ASIO spied on Australians protesting against the Pine Gap Joint Defence Facility in the Northern Territory. The Pine Gap facility is jointly run by the Australian Signals Directorate, or ASD, which works closely with ASIO, as well as US intelligence agencies, including the CIA and the NSA. Historically, the facility has been used to identify targets for the US military in foreign countries. But more recently, it's been revealed that it's also provided the Israeli army with communications and electronic intelligence during the genocide in Gaza. ASIO and the ASD have a close working relationship, and they're both integral parts of what is called the Australian Intelligence Community, or AIC. ASIO's spying has been so extensive that back in 2011, it was estimated that the agency had dossiers on 500,000 of this country's citizens.
An estimated 500,000 Australians have intelligence files, which essentially means all the intimate details of their lives are recorded by ASIO surveillance teams.
Another reason to be skeptical of ASIO's intel that Iran was behind the arson attacks is that some of it appears to have been supplied by Israel. Why do I say that? Well, let's start by looking at this exchange during the government press conference back on the 26th of August.
Prime Minister, how long has the government suspected that Iran was involved in these attacks, and what is the nature of the evidence that shows that Iran was involved in these attacks?
So we informed the government yesterday of our assessment. Our investigations have been ongoing since October last year and involves ASIO's own collected intelligence, the great work of the Australian Federal Police, and liaison with foreign partners.
As you've just seen, rather than answering the questions, Albanese looked to ASIO chief Mike Burgess for help. Burgess didn't answer the question about the nature of the evidence, but he did disclose that the investigation included liaison with foreign partners. Now, who might those foreign partners be? Well, Burgess didn't say, but on the following day, Sky News' Shari Markson dropped this bombshell.
But first tonight, I can exclusively reveal that Israeli intelligence agencies assisted ASIO in its investigation into Iran's terror attacks on Australia.
Markson went on to claim that Israel provided ASIO with a major tip-off in relation to one of the two attacks. While Markson's claim was based on confidential sources, she is probably the Australian journalist with the closest relationship to the current Israeli government, having conducted world-exclusive interviews with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and scoring a private 45-minute meeting with him when she travelled to Israel last year. So I think it's safe to assume that if an Israeli official is going to leak sensitive info like this to an Aussie journo, it's most likely going to be her. Markson's claim was repeated in the Israeli mainstream media, and crucially, it hasn't been denied by either the Australian or the Israeli government. If some of the intel has Israeli origin, there's even less reason for us to trust it. Why? Because Israel's #1 enemy is Iran, and therefore it has a clear motive in trying to damage Australia's relationship with the Islamic Republic. This is all the more important at a time when many experts predict that Israel is gearing up for a further and more extensive war with Iran in the coming months, and has reportedly sought the permission of the US to do this. This shouldn't come as a surprise, given Israel's long history of seeking Western support for a war against Iran. One of the key ways in which Israel has done this is by alleging that, based on its intelligence, Iran is on the brink of developing nuclear weapons. Let's take Netanyahu, for example. On the 13th of June this year, immediately after Israel launched its military strikes on Iran, Netanyahu gave this justification to the world.
If not stopped, Iran could produce a nuclear weapon in a very short time. It could be a year, it could be within a few months, less than a year. This is a clear and present danger to Israel's very survival.
Most of the mainstream media in the West parroted Netanyahu's claims unquestioningly, without any mention of the fact that he's been saying very similar things for more than 3 decades now. For example, back in 1995, when Netanyahu was still a rising member of the Israeli Knesset, he made this claim on CBS News.
Iran will be capable of producing alone, without importing anything, nuclear bombs within 3 to 5 years.
In 2002, Netanyahu gave evidence before a US congressional committee in which he called for the US to launch an invasion of Iraq.
Are there any other nations that you would recommend that the United States launch preemptive attacks upon at this point?
The two nations that are vying, competing with each other, who will be the first to achieve nuclear weapons, is Iraq and Iran.
4 years later, in 2006, Netanyahu claimed this on the Glenn Beck program.
Iran is gearing up to produce 25 bombs, atomic bombs a year, 250 bombs in a decade.
In 2012, after numerous Iranian nuclear scientists were killed in suspected Mossad attacks, Netanyahu addressed the United Nations and alleged that Iran was well into the second stage of nuclear enrichment and
by next spring, at most by next summer, at current enrichment rates, they will have finished the medium enrichment and move on to the final stage. From there, it's only a few months, possibly a few weeks, before they get enough enriched uranium for the first bomb.
In 2015, Netanyahu returned to the UN to scold the US and EU for having entered into the Iran nuclear deal, rather than taking military action against Tehran.
Iran is also building intercontinental ballistic missiles whose sole purpose is to carry nuclear warheads.
So with this track record and such a compelling motive to seek to damage Iran's relationship with Australia, I think it's fair to say that any intel that ASIO has received from Israel should be treated with great suspicion. And it's for this same reason that many Australians have gone one step further and suggested that Israel itself may be behind the arson attacks. The most prominent example of this is that of the world-renowned cardiologist Professor Peter MacDonald, who, during a Q&A session at a recent public forum about the Israel lobby's influence in Australia, made this comment which arguably appears to be at least partly lighthearted.
I learned earlier this week that Iran was behind the terrorist attacks or anti-Semitic terrorist attacks in Sydney. I thought it was a no-brainer that these were Mossad-engineered events. Am I being totally naive, or has the Zionist lobby taken over ASIO as well?
As I discussed in a reel that I made for Instagram, the lobby responded to Professor MacDonald's comments by campaigning aggressively for him to be fired. The campaign appears to be working, as Professor MacDonald is now reported to have been stood down by his hospital. Now, the pro-Israel media in this country has played a vital role in this campaign, labelling MacDonald's remarks as a bizarre conspiracy theory. But is that really a fair description of what he said? As we've already established in this video, Israel undeniably had a strong motive to organise the arson attacks here. And it clearly had the means as well. If Israel can infiltrate Iran and organise dissidents there to launch sophisticated military operations against their own country, I don't think it's a stretch for them to get some Aussie crims to light a couple of fires down under. But would Israel seriously do something like this? Well, it actually wouldn't be the first time. In 1954, Israeli military intelligence launched a failed covert operation in Egypt in which it recruited a group of Egyptian Jews to plant bombs inside American, British and Egyptian-owned cinemas, libraries and other civilian targets. The objective of the operation was to falsely blame the bombings on the Muslim Brotherhood and communists in Egypt. But the plan was foiled and the conspirators were caught. The operation became known as the Levon Affair, after the Israeli Defense Minister at the time, Pinhas Levon, who was forced to resign as a result of the scandal. Israel officially denied any involvement until 2005, when it finally admitted responsibility and honoured the surviving spies by presenting them with certificates of appreciation. The Levon Affair is an example of what is known as a false flag operation, which is an attack carried out for the purpose of blaming someone else for it. Now, the Levon Affair wasn't the only false flag operation that Israel has been involved in. A few years earlier, in 1950 and 1951, there was a series of bomb attacks against synagogues and other Jewish targets in Baghdad, Iraq. These terrorist attacks played an important role in motivating nearly all of the approximately 120,000 members of Iraq's Jewish community to flee the country that they had prospered in for centuries and migrate to Israel, which had just been established on the ruins of Palestine. One of those Iraqi Jews who had fled as a young boy was Israeli historian Avi Shleim. In his excellent book 3 Worlds, Memoirs of an Arab Jew, Shleim dedicates an entire chapter to the bombings, of which there were 5 in total. Shleim sets out in great detail the evidence which he claims overwhelmingly proves that members of a Zionist underground cell were behind 3 of the 5 attacks, which Shleim argues were committed with the intention of furthering the long-standing goal of encouraging Jewish migration to Israel. This is Shleim speaking in an interview with Middle East Eye in 2023.
Bombings in Baghdad in 1950-51 were not a one-off thing, that it was part of a pattern of false flag operations, and it was part of what somebody described as cruel Zionism. And this was particularly cruel because it involved innocent Jews, decent Jews, good people, and the Zionist movement or the intelligence officers turned these Jews in Baghdad and then later in Cairo, they turned them into terrorists.
In 2010, Israel carried out the brazen assassination of a Hamas leader in Dubai.
Minute by minute, this is the lead-up to the Dubai assassination of one of the founding members of Hamas, all captured on security cameras and released by the Emirates police. 10 men and 1 woman, the alleged hit squad. Some check into the Al Bustan Road Hanna hotel and await their target. This is Mahmoud al-Mabhou arriving at the hotel, where he would be killed just hours later.
The assailants used passports from various countries, including Australia. A former Mossad officer, Viktor Ostrovsky, later alleged that the intelligence agency has its own passport factory used to create or doctor passports for use in intelligence operations. Ostrovsky went on to say that most of these Mossad operations are carried out on what's called false flag, that is, pretending to be of another country. In 2012, a series of CIA memos were released which revealed that Mossad agents had posed as American spies to recruit members of the terrorist organization Jundullah to fight a covert war against Iran. When we understand this history, we can see that Israel had the motive, the means, and the modus operandi to organize the arson attacks in Australia. So I don't think there's anything bizarre or conspiratorial about what Professor McDonald said. But to be clear, I'm not alleging that Israel is responsible. In fact, I highly doubt that it was. As I discussed a little earlier, these attacks were entirely unsophisticated and carried out by people who were inept, low-level criminals. If Israel was going to stage such a high-stakes false flag operation here, I think it's almost implausible that it would do it in this way. It would hire professionals to do the job properly and to do it in a way that would more readily implicate Iran. Another part of Professor McDonald's comment that he was condemned for was his suggestion that ASIO's claim of Iranian involvement was due to influence by the Israel lobby. Now, I'll be making a separate video about the influence of the lobby on Australia's national security in the near future. But for now, I should make the point that the Israel lobby has been campaigning for years for Australia to adopt a more hardline position against Iran and to prescribe the IRGC as a terrorist organisation. For example, at a Senate inquiry about Iran in 2022, all of the prominent Israel lobby groups such as the Australia, Israel and Jewish Affairs Council, the Zionist Federation of Australia, the Executive Council of Australian Jewry and the Australian Jewish Association all made submissions in favour of legislative reform that would allow the federal government to list the IRGC as a terrorist organisation under the Commonwealth Criminal Code. Now, the head of ASIO, Mike Burgess, is no stranger to the Israel lobby. In 2014, when he was Chief Information Security Officer of Telstra, he was a keynote speaker at an event organised by the Australia-Israel Chamber of Commerce, or AICC. As I discussed in episode 2 of this podcast, the AICC is a lobby group with close ties to the Israeli weapons industry, including being sponsored by Israel's largest arms manufacturer, Elbit Systems. Elbit Systems makes many of the weapons used by the Israeli military to carry out its genocidal war in Gaza. Burgess was speaking with Amnon Bar-Lev, the then president of the Israeli cybersecurity company Checkpoint Software. Checkpoint was founded by former Israeli intelligence officers and continues to collaborate closely with the Israeli weapons industry. In 2015, while Burgess was still with Telstra, he spoke at an event organised by Checkpoint itself. Immediately prior to being appointed to lead ASIO, Burgess was the head of the Australian Signals Directorate, or ASD, where Burgess had previously worked for 18 years before he joined Telstra. As I spoke about earlier in this video, the ASD jointly runs the Pine Gap facility, which shares military intelligence with Israel, including during the current genocide. Interestingly, Burgess was reportedly the most senior ASD official at Pine Gap. As an aside, I should mention that ASD officers now receive training from the Israeli company Cyberbit, which is a subsidiary of Elbit Systems. Cyberbit boasts on its website that it provides battle-hardened cybersecurity solutions. The company doesn't explain what it means by battle-hardened, but it's likely a reference to its products having been tested by the Israeli military in Gaza. The procurement of Cyberbit's contract with the ASD may well have been assisted by the AICC, which in 2018 hosted Cyberbit as part of its Cyber Roadshow tour here. Yet another reason to have concerns about the Australian government's claim that Iran was behind the anti-Semitic attacks here is the timing and circumstances in which the claim was made. It's important to remember that for the past 2 years, there has been a gradual but appreciable deterioration of the relationship between the Israeli and Australian governments, largely due to the latter's unwillingness to provide the kind of unwavering and unconditional support to Israel that countries like the US, UK, and Germany have given. Now, to be clear, Australia has provided meaningful support to Israel on a number of fronts during its genocide in Gaza. and the concern that the Australian government has expressed about Israeli excesses has been sparing, largely performative, and seemingly motivated not by a genuine commitment to human rights principles, but rather due to the groundswell of opposition amongst everyday Australians to Israel's brutal offensive in Gaza. But even that is unacceptable to Israel. The tensions came to a head when the Albanese government announced on the 11th of August that it would recognise a Palestinian state.
After months of posturing and protests, Australia will formally recognise the state of Palestine at the United Nations next month.
The announcement itself was dismissed by most Palestinians and their allies for the simple reason that it does nothing to stop the genocide in Gaza or to place any real pressure on Israel in the way that sanctions or a two-way arms embargo would. But nonetheless, Israel was furious. Prime Minister Netanyahu unleashed his fiercest criticism of Albanese yet, calling him a weak politician who betrayed Israel in a post on X. More importantly, Netanyahu sent his Australian counterpart a letter in which he alleged that anti-Semitism had intensified under Albanese's watch, and he called for Albo to replace weakness with action, appeasement with resolve, and to do so by the Jewish New Year on the 23rd of September. So there you have it, a clear ultimatum being given by Israel to the Australian government for it to take action. Now what that action was supposed to be, we don't know, but what we do know is this. Within hours of Albanese's announcement to cut ties with Iran, Israel was already taking credit for it. Speaking at a press conference in Tel Aviv, Israeli government spokesperson David Mencer said this in response to a question seeking Israel's reaction to what, at least for the rest of the world, was breaking news.
Well, let me put it this way. The Prime Minister Netanyahu has made a very forthright intervention when it comes to Australia, a country which we have a long history of friendly relations. He made those comments because he did not believe that the actions of the Australian government had gone anywhere near far enough to address the issues of anti-Semitism.
No doubt the intervention that Mencer was referring to was Netanyahu's escalation of attacks on Albanese and the ultimatum that he'd given the PM. Mencer went on to make the causal link even clearer.
The relationship between this country and Australia was damaged, and so it's welcome that after the Prime Minister Netanyahu's timely intervention that these actions have been taken by Australia's government.
Now it's worth noting that David Mencer wasn't the only one to make this claim. Indeed, Iran itself has blamed Israel for Australia's decision to sever relations. In a scathing post on X, Iran's foreign minister said, "I am not in the habit of joining causes with wanted war criminals, but Netanyahu is right about one thing. Australia's PM is indeed a weak politician. Iran is paying the price for the Australian people's support for Palestine. Canberra should know better than to appease a regime led by war criminals. Doing so will only embolden Netanyahu and his ilk." Australia's Minister for Home Affairs, Tony Burke, rejected the claim that Israel was responsible. But is this really all that surprising? I mean, in what world would the Australian government admit that the real reason for its decision to cut ties with Iran was based on pressure from a foreign entity, even if it were true? Now, to be clear, I'm not alleging that the decision was an attempt to placate Israel. But in circumstances where both Israel and Iran are claiming this, and the claim makes sense, it warrants an independent investigation in my view. Unless and until such an investigation excludes Israel's claim of responsibility as being false, we should be very wary about accepting the Australian government's official narrative. Okay, the last reason to doubt the claim that Iran is behind the arson attacks here concerns their alleged motive. The Australian government says that Iran carried out these attacks to undermine social cohesion in this country. But this theory just doesn't make sense. Prior to last week, Australia had one of the least hostile positions of any Western country towards Iran. And despite the efforts of the lobby, Australia had, until now, resisted its call to prescribe the IRGC as a terrorist organisation. Unlike Israel, Iran stood to gain nothing by doing this, but it did stand to lose a lot. These attacks provided the perfect excuse for Australia to ban the IRGC, and Iran would have known that. And if genuine anti-Semitism was the alleged motive, why would Iran want to attack Jews down under when Iran is home to one of the oldest Jewish communities itself? Wouldn't it be easier for the IRGC to burn a synagogue in Tehran than on the other side of the world? Finally, the Adass Israel synagogue that was attacked in Melbourne is known to be home to an ultra-Orthodox, anti-Zionist Jewish community that doesn't officially recognise the State of Israel. So of all the synagogues that Iran could have targeted, this one makes the least sense. Now, to be clear, I don't know who's behind these attacks, and I can't definitively say that it wasn't Iran. But it's crucial to remember that it's the Australian government that bears the onus of proof here. It's the one that's accused Iran, and so it's the one that needs to make its case. And in my view, it hasn't even come close to doing that. The greater the consequence of any decision by a government, the greater the need for there to be compelling reasons underpinning the decision and transparency in relation to the decision-making process. Here the stakes couldn't be any higher. Not only will the severing of ties with Iran cause irreparable harm between Australia and one of the most important players in the Middle East, but it'll also have a chilling effect on political expression in this country. There is a raft of extremely serious criminal offence provisions under the Criminal Code that prohibit various forms of support for prohibited terrorist organisations. For example, the offence of publicly displaying a symbol of a prescribed terrorist organisation, which includes waving a flag, is punishable by 5 years imprisonment with a mandatory minimum sentence of 12 months jail time. These offences will soon apply to the IRGC as a result of the prescription. Now, in case you're wondering, I personally don't support the Iranian government on an ideological level, and I've got no desire to wave an IRGC flag in public. But that's not the point. I'd never want to live in a country where people aren't free to wave a flag from Iran, in the same way that I'd never want to live in a country where people aren't free to wave the Israeli flag, as much as a bad idea as I think that is. I believe that freedom of speech is a cornerstone of our democracy and a principle we must defend at all costs. And it's for this reason I think that all Australians should oppose the government's decision to ban the IRGC, regardless of what you think about Iran or Israel. Okay, so that brings me to the end of today's episode. If you made it this far, that hopefully means you value my journalism, or you're working for ASIO or Mossad. But either way, please let me know what you think in the comments section, and don't forget to like the video and subscribe to my channel. Until next time.